right, guys, we're going to get started. Okay. So today, we're honored to have... Okay, hey guys, we're going to get started. Okay, today we're honored to have Princeton grad Matt Hawrilenko here to speak for us. So he's been around since the very beginning of online poker pretty much, played the high stakes games back when everyone was playing limit hold'em instead of no limit hold'em, and still played all the way through until, I guess, like Black Friday, when online poker became illegal. But he still plays like the World Series, is a bracelet winner, and has done research with Bill Chen and Jared Ankerman, and you guys saw Bill Chen last week. So without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Matt.
Thanks, Will. So I'm actually super excited to be here. I've wanted to give a poker talk for a really long time, but I've also felt pretty ambivalent about it, right? Like, on the plus side, really fun. On the minus side, don't want to give up my secrets. But, so one thing Will didn't mention, actually, earlier this summer, I kind of semi-retired. I started a PhD program in clinical psych, so now the giving up the secrets thing doesn't really matter anymore. So here we are. So today I want to talk to you a bit about game theory. So last week, this is not working. Yeah. All right. It's actually frozen. Yeah, it's actually frozen. Wait, the mouse is moving.
I think the computer just froze. I think it's okay. Plug it.
Good. Okay, so here we go. So last week, Bill Chen came and talked to you guys, and he told you a bit about the Ace King Queen game, did kind of more nitty-gritty game theory, looked at some toy games, and kind of saw the way that game theorists think about poker. So I've actually done a lot of work with Bill Chen and Jared Ankerman. And by work with, I mean I was kind of present for while they were doing the work, and I kind of applied it a lot to poker. So those guys taught me pretty much everything I know about poker, and certainly all the good stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the Ace King Queen game that Bill talked about last week, and I want to show you guys how we would map it onto the real game of poker, right? So we have the simple game, and I want to show you how we would kind of map that and use it to play a real poker hand. So the goals of the talk today, pretty simple. Ideally, I'm kind of hoping in the next 80 minutes or so that I can give you guys all the tools you need to learn to go to the Bellagio and beat the 2,000, 4,000 game. We'll see how that goes. But what I want to talk about is, applying game theory at the table, becoming critical consumers of poker advice, right? Like, we hear all these tactics and all these strategies, but how do we really evaluate them, right? And game theory is going to give us a tool to do that. And also, kind of as you guys are wrapping up this class next week, I think it's a really good tool to continually evolve your game. And that's something I'm going to spend, particularly the second half of the talk, talking a lot about. So first, I called this talk Game Theory in Practice, A Tale of Two Hands. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through a poker hand in a sort of typical way that most players, really good players, might think about it. I'm going to go back through it, and I'm going to look at it from a game theoretic perspective. And I'm going to kind of show you how those two perspectives diverge. And even if you don't want to become kind of like a hardcore game theorist like Bill and Jared, I think that there's something here for you, right? I think game theory can kind of add a lot to anybody's poker game, and I kind of want to show you how to integrate the two. So at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about game theory-informed exploitive play. I digress a lot, probably talk a bit about tells, really like Harry Potter, so that'll probably come up. But anyhow, without further ado, let's get going. So first, Bill did a lot of game theory, so I want to start off straight with a poker hand. I kind of want to see where you guys are at, what you're thinking. So we have, we're the hero. We have 1.8 million chips. Blinds are 12 and 24,000, so we have something like, what's that, like 70 big blinds or so? So we're playing six-handed, and there's a $3,000 ante. So we're two off the button. We have pocket aces. Good way to start the hand, good way to start the class. So we open 65,000 and the big blind calls. The flop is king jack 8, he checks. We bet 75,000, he calls. Turn is the 5 of clubs, which, no club, sorry. He checks. We bet 205,000, he calls. The river's the king clubs. So at this point, the pot is 720,000, and our opponent bets 1,080,000, putting us all in. So I just want you guys to take a second and think here about what you do. We're going to go through this hand a lot, so I kind of want you to feel it, right? So raise your hand. Who's going to raise? Nobody's going to raise. Okay. Who's going to call? Some of us maybe are going to call. I can't really see. Come on, proud. Get him up there. And who's going to fold? Okay, so it looks like probably 2/3 of us are going to fold, 1/3 of us are going to call. So do you have enough information? Is there any other stuff you guys want to know? Yeah. Okay, so you kind of want to have an idea of how he plays, his betting style. What else? Anything else? Right, so we kind of want to get a read on his play. He's betting a lot, right? 1,080,000, he's betting 1.5 times the pot. Kind of want to have an idea of what that means. How many chips he has? Okay, so he's starting the hand. He's got us covered. So he's got 2.7 million chips. So we've got that.
Obviously, that goes in things like that. Like, if you would want to get a value bet from us, like that's a very good bet, right? And we weren't betting.
Yeah. No, yeah, it's a big bet, right? 1.5 times the pot. Anything else you guys want to know? Is that a hand? How long he took to call after the hero bets? Okay, good. Interesting. Yeah, good piece of information. We're playing live, by the way. We're sitting at a table. Anyone want to look at him? Anyone want to get a physical read on him? These guys do. He wants to get a read. He wants to get a read. And he wants to get a read too. It's uncomfortable, right? Like, I don't like that. I don't like when he stares at me. It's really uncomfortable, right? But first off, if we get to this point, we've probably done pretty well, right? Like, if he doesn't really know what to do, we've pretty much done our job. Second, I'll let you guys in on a little secret. So what's going through his head right now, what he's thinking is something kind of like this. I had some music there. Okay. So if when we get to this point, right, like he's thinking categorically, and he's trying to get a read on us because he doesn't know what to do, and that's kind of a siren song. This whole idea of getting reads. So it's something that I'm gonna kind of argue against, at least a little bit. So the first thing, right, like one thing I can tell you about tells, at this point, after about a second after you've bet, there are no tells you can get, pretty much. Like any of the good stuff is going to happen in the first second. There's actually a bit of interesting data here. So they did a bunch of studies where they'd bring in, the expert FBI body language interrogators. Then they'd bring in your average Joes, and they'd show them clips of people lying, even in high-stakes circumstances, or they might show them clips of earlier interrogations, and they'd ask both groups to figure out who is lying and who is telling the truth. And it turns out that on pretty much every metric, the groups performed equally, right? They both got it right about 53% of the time, where 50% of the time would be chance. And these are like, the FBI's experts, right? So one metric where they were different. The experts were much, much more confident than they were right than the non-experts, right? So it's kind of like this whole idea of confirmation bias. They've been doing it for a while. They kind of remember the ones they got right. They forget the ones they got wrong. So high degree of confidence, no more accuracy. So kind of moving past that for a second, what I want to talk to you about today, first, there are kind of three typical exploitive strategies, right? So these aren't game theory strategies, they're the way most people play. So when we learn to play, first we think about playing my hand versus your hand, right? And what I'm doing there is I'm kind of saying, okay, well, he raised under the gun in early position. I think the most likely hand he has there is ace-king. Okay, the flop came down with queen high, so I'm probably going to go with it, right? I'm trying to figure out how what I have, I'm going to go with it with my pair of tens. I'm trying to figure out how what I have stacks up against the most likely hand I think you have. And I think most of us learn pretty quickly that this isn't a great way to play poker. You know, it's really hard to pigeonhole someone on a specific hand. So what most people do is they start thinking about distributions. And I know that in your class, this is what you guys do, right? And this is what so many of like the best players do. It's a good way to play. So you guys probably know what this, I'm going to use it a lot, so I kind of want to go over the term. So by distribution, I mean the frequency distribution of hands a player might hold given all the action that's occurred, right? So he raises before the flop, checks, he bets on the flop, you raise, he three bets, you call, check, he bets, right? So after that entire sequence, all the hands he might hold. And why this is different from my hand versus your hand is we're kind of thinking of ourselves in the long run a little bit, right? Like in the long run, all the times that he makes these plays, what might he have? And we're trying to wield our hand to do the best we can against that, right? So that's probably how most of you guys play. So the third way to play is going to be my distribution versus your distribution. And that's kind of just taking it one step further. All the times I play this hand against him and all the times he plays this hand against me, how can I shape all the hands I hold to do the best against all the hands he holds? So what all these three things have in common is they're sort of, it's kind of like a divination, right? Like I'm trying to figure out what you have. I'm trying to surmise your strategy the best I can. Okay, where are we going here? Talked about that. So I'm trying to figure out your strategy the best I can. So as I'm trying to guess your strategy, you're trying to obfuscate your strategy, right? So call this leveling. So I guess, you level, right? You change, I adapt, you adapt, I adapt, you adapt, right? And this always has to happen when we're all thinking about each other's distributions. So the problem here, right? So we kind of talk about decision-making biases. The problem here is this idea of self-assessment bias, which probably can figure it out from what it's called. Landmark study a couple decades ago of GE engineers, right? So they surveyed 92 GE engineers, and they asked them where did they rate amongst all the engineers in their company. And the average response was like the 78th percentile. And out of all 92 of them, only 2 of them put themselves in the bottom half, right? So engineers, math-savvy folks do this. We all do this, right? So for example, you guys are probably going to do this right now. Raise your hand if you're a below-average driver. Right? Not quite half, probably way less than half. But, I mean, half of us are, right? So we all do this. So in poker, this has to happen. You know, you walk into the Bellagio, you see a table full of pros, right? People who play for a living. Why is the table full? Everyone thinks they have edge, right? Everyone thinks that they can out-level the next guy. Zero sum. So this is a great scene in the beginning of the sixth Harry Potter book, where Cornelius Fudge, the Minister of Magic, comes and he's talking to the Muggle Prime Minister. And he's telling him about all these bad things that are happening because of this wizard war, right? So like, they're blowing up bridges, they're causing earthquakes, they're causing storms. And the Muggle Prime Minister says, but can't you stop them, you guys? You know magic. And Cornelius Fudge says, the trouble is, the other side can do magic too, Prime Minister. And this happens to us a lot in poker. So I'll tell you quickly about one hand I played where this happened to me. So 5 years ago, 6 years ago. I was playing in kind of one of my first World Series events, and we got down to, it was a big tournament, there were 2,000 people, so we got down to the bubble, right, like right before you make the money. And I had a good sized stack. I think I had kind of 12 starting stacks, so I was a little bit above average. I was in good shape to make the money. And there was this guy at my table, to my direct left, who was just so excited to be there, right? He's like, wow, I'm about to cash in the World Series. This is amazing. So for like 45 minutes, kind of before the bubble, he just gotten up and walked away from the table. He just wasn't there. He was telling everyone how cool it was going to be to finally cash. So I'm sitting there thinking to myself, when he comes back just before the bubble, this is amazing. I get all of this guy's chips every single time it folds to me, right? So sure enough, there are 3 people left in the bubble, so probably 1 or 2 more hands, and we're all in the money. Chip value, I don't know if have you guys done ICM yet? All right. So basically, chip values are linear at this point, right? So it's kind of like a cash game because the step into the money is really small. And folds around to me. So I look down, I see 4 deuce offsuit. And I'm like, free money. So I, shove in 12 times the big blind. And he says, I knew you were going to do that. I call blind. So my read is so far off, right? So he calls blind, he flips up 9 deuce. So think of the parlay that has to happen here, right? Like, my read has to be so far off that not only will he not play super tight, that he won't look at his hand. If he looks at his hand, he has to fold, right? Like, he's way down the bottom of his distribution. He's doing pretty terribly against a random hand. If he looks at his hand, he has to fold. But my read is just a disaster. So, of course, he busts me, and I get crap about it from my friends for the next 7 and counting years. But like, it was a reasonable read to make. I talked to other people at the table. They kind of had the same idea, but he can do magic too, right? And that was a fun bit of magic. So, what I want to talk about is what game theory has to say about all of this. So, last week Bill talked to you guys a bit about the history of game theory. He talked to you a bit about, John Nash and von Neumann and the bomb and whatever. But turns out that 15, 16 centuries ago, so do you guys know what this is? This is the Temple of Apollo at Delphi in Greece, where all the ancient Greeks would go to the oracle, right, to learn their futures. So inscribed there are, I think, 3 bits of advice that are pretty much going to sum up how game theorists think about poker. So the first one, know thyself, right? What we're going to talk a lot about today is this whole idea of reading your own hand. So, and the claim I'm going to make is that much more important than trying to put the other guy on a hand is knowing exactly what you would have in every single spot. And if you do that well, you don't have to think about the other guy's distribution. Sounds like a simple thing. Turns out it's pretty hard. And the process of doing this, to me, is how I think you become a really strong poker player. So first, we're going to talk about know thyself, read your own hand. The second thing that was carved into the walls was nothing in excess, right? And how we're going to interpret this is this whole idea of playing with balance. Balance is very important to game theory strategies. If you guys remember the Ace, King, Queen game, we really tried to carve out just the right balance. So we're going to talk about having perfect ratios of value bets to bluffs, nothing in excess. And the last thing is make a pledge, and mischief is nigh. Nigh is a great word, by the way, and I had a little trouble thinking how this might apply to poker, but I couldn't just use 2 out of 3. So what I'm going to take this to mean is sort of twofold. One, don't forget to do your Bayesian updating, right? Like where you are in your hand, where you are in your distribution changes, right? Like we have all these heuristics, or we have all these plans, right? We might check behind to induce a bluff. And then a weird card comes off where all of a sudden we were trying to induce action, and then we get the action, and game theoretically, we have to fold. So, you know, making a pledge, making a plan, just because you're being deceptive and sneaky doesn't mean that you necessarily have to keep up with that, but I won't labor over these anymore. So I want to review really quickly the ace, king, queen game. So there are like a million versions of this that you can solve, that Bill and Jared solved in their book. But basically the gist again was this. 3-card deck, you have an ace, a king, and a queen. You deal it out to 2 players, the high card wins. And so the way we're going to map this onto poker is that aces are kind of like nut hands, queens are all our bluffs, and kings are all the hands that we catch bluffs with. So, yeah, that's right. Okay, and we're not going to go through the math again, but again, so if we're trying to figure out what to do with our kings, with our bluff catchers, what we're going to do is solve for the calling frequency that makes our opponent indifferent to bluffing, right? And so what that looked like was this. So basically we're saying the amount that Y loses when X calls should equal the amount that Y wins when X folds. Okay, so we kind of do out the little equation and we get what we call one of the magic ratios in poker, alpha, right? So alpha is equal to S, which is the fraction of the pot that you're betting, over 1 plus S, which is the pot plus the fraction of the pot, right? So we're calling the pot 1. So if you're bluffing half the time, if you're value betting half the time, the amount that you should bluff is, if you're betting half the pot, the ratio of hands that you should bluff is 0.5 over 1 plus 0.5, right? So you should be bluffing about a third of the time. And you should be calling the inverse of that, right? You should be calling 1 over 1 plus 0.5. So 2/3 of your hands that can beat a bluff. And this is important. So not 2/3 of all your hands, 2/3 of your hands that can beat a bluff. So first off, if we're going to be calling with this frequency, right? So suppose somebody bets the pot, right? So game theory is telling us that we should call about half the time. Whereas pot odds, if somebody bets the pot, we're getting 2 to 1. We're thinking, okay, I'm getting 2 to 1, so I need to win about a third of the time to break even. So any thoughts? Why is this kind of different thinking than pot odds?
I mean, well, the 2 questions aren't really related. Like, pot odds is a question about your opponent.
Yeah.
Can you keep like a third of the same, like a third of the distribution?
Exactly. So pot odds, we're still playing that divination game, right? We're trying to think, how is my hand doing against his hand? And I think this is how probably most people think on the river. You get to the river and you're like, how is my hand doing against his hand? We're trying to surmise his strategy, and we're trying to see how we do against his distribution. Game theory says we're not doing that, right? What we're doing is we're trying to make our opponent indifferent to bluffing. So that's great. In the ace, king, queen game, that's great. It's pretty clear how it works. It's pretty easy when we have these kind of discrete hand types. So mapping it to real poker is a little harder. So when we try to map this discrete game to this game where we have these continuous distributions, you know, we have some nut hands, some really close to nut hands, a whole bunch in the middle, and some really terrible ones. The first thing we're going to do when we're betting is we need to figure out the worst hand that we would value bet. And we're basically going to map that region to the aces in the ace, king, queen game, right? So if our board was king, jack, 8, 5, king, we basically want to choose, like, what are the hands I'm trying to get value with? And so when we map this to the game, we're going to map these to the aces. And then we're going to bluff alpha of our worst hands, right? And so we're going to map the worst hands to a queen. Conversely, when we're calling, we want to choose the worst hand that can beat a bluff, right? So like, what is your minimum threshold bluff catcher? We're going to map those to a king. And then we're going to call with the top of that region. So that region being all our bluff catchers and all our value hands. And so when I say call, if there are more chips, call basically means continue, right? So we can raise with some fraction of those for value if we want. can raise some for bluffs. But we need to continue with 1 minus alpha of all our bluff catchers and better. So that kind of looks like this. So, you know, in the real game, so we showed that king, jack, 8, 5 king hand. So like, obviously like quad kings would be right up top. Maybe something like pair fives would be kind of our beats a bluff, somewhere in there. But anyhow, what we're doing is we're mapping these regions. So what I'm going to talk about now a little bit is reading your own hand. And the big thing that we get from the ace, king, queen game is that what we do with one hand depends on what we do with all of our other hands, right? So we kind of want to see where we are in our own distribution. So if we, you know, whatever our distribution looks like, if we are at the top 1 minus alpha of our bluff catching range, we have to, you know, we have to call. And if we're not, we have to fold. And again, I think this is hugely important. It's probably, in my view, the most important skill in poker. And so in the process of reading our own hand, right, and we're about to go through an example, we have to take 2 steps. So as we go through a hand, we have to figure out, okay, so I know all the hands that I would have raised pre-flop. We'll enumerate the combinations. And then when the flop comes out, we have to account for card removal, right? So if you have 16 combinations of ace king before the flop, and then a king flops, that's a quarter of your king's gone, so now you can only have 12 combinations of ace king. So we're going to account for card removal, and then on each street, we're going to weight the decision node. So let me show you how that works. So in the first hand that we went through, right? So the hero's 2 off the button. That ace isn't supposed to be there. Okay. Raise 65,000, and the villain calls. So right now, that's annoying. So this is our pre-flop distribution for just that sequence of actions, right? So I feel like I'm probably raising all my pairs, some suited connectors, ace, king, king, queen, queen, jack, jack 10, some 1-gappers, some 2-gappers, some 3-gappers. It's not perfect, but it's about an approximation, right? This is about what I'd have in that spot. So flop comes down king, jack 8, and we have to update it. So you'll see, like, I thought I'd highlighted these for you guys. So like, I think I have the wrong slide in here. Okay. Well, I promise in the next slides things are actually updated. So anyhow, after updating those properly, the villain's going to check the hero bet 75,000. The villain calls. There we go. So after all these actions, right? So here are all the combinations that we had. And so after the flop, right? So hands I'm not going to bet, right? I'm not going to have 6s. I'm not going to have 7s. I'm not going to have 9s or 10s or 9-8 suited or 8-7 suited. So I kind of go down from 300 or so combinations to 161 combinations. So again, we do this quickly. We go through the turn. What am I going to have after I bet 205,000 and he calls? It's probably going to look something like this. Probably not going to continue with my deuces, 3s, or 4s. Probably not going to continue with my 6-5s or jack 10s or jack 9s. So we're down to 121 combinations. And finally, get the river action. So what do we want to do here, right? So we want to figure out how much do we have to call. So he bets 1,080,000 with a 720K pot. So we have to call 40% of the time, right? So 1.5, the amount he bets, over the pot plus the fraction of the pot that he bets. So we have to call 40% of the time. So when you enumerate your river distribution, and then what we're doing here is just doing cumulative frequencies of all the hands that would beat a bluff. So what we're going to say is, in this distribution, the best hand or the worst hand that we have that beats a bluff is queen jack, right? So no queen. So we're not going to say queen high beats a bluff. So out of these frequencies, we have to call with about 40% of our hands. So where does that bring us? That brings us to we have to call with our king queens. We're folding our king tens. So aces, those of you guys who said fold, that's kind of where this distribution is coming out. So the question is, so we're folding aces, right? We're folding ace jack. We're even folding some king queens. Ace jack in there. But how do we feel about that? The question is, do we want a distribution where we actually have to fold trips? What do you guys think? Are you good with this? Okay, who's happy folding king queen here?
I mean, I think, so the point is, that is actually our distribution that we get to that point. And our opponent knows that. So either he's bluffing like 9-10, or he made a full toss. But if he knows that's our distribution, and that is in fact our distribution, then we should fold.
Okay. So I agree with you. So we get to this point, that's our distribution, we should fold. So we're good? We're good with folding king, queen, king 10? So this is where we kind of need to talk about how the model works a little bit. So the way the ace, king, queen game works, again, we map things onto aces, kings, and queens. So we're assuming that we kind of have these discrete distributions of value bets, bluff catchers, and bluffs, right? So up here, these are clear value bets. This is still in our value betting distribution, right? So this is kind of like the absolute strength of hands, right? So like king, king, and king, jack are in our distribution. King 8 isn't. There are going to be some hands that are in our distribution, some aren't. But where we are in our own distribution is kind of telling us where we should be, right? And so personally, if he had checked it to me, and I had king, queen, or king 10, or whatever, I'm betting that for value, right? Like it feels to me like it's not even close. So when we go through and read our own hands, one of the things that a good rule of thumb with the river is if you bet it for value, you want to craft a distribution where you don't actually have to fold it, right? So this is kind of using gut checks to look at our model. Another thing we kind of want to do is correlate the pot size to the strength of our hand, right? So kind of want to be, as we move along, building really big pots with the top hands and balancing them out with some bluffs or whatever, building kind of medium-sized pots with the not-so-good value hands. And again, these are just kind of checks, right? So we read our own hand, we get to the river, and we can run these checks to see how we're doing. So, yeah, quick side note. So a while ago, someone coined this idea, the fundamental theorem of chasing, kind of a riff on the fundamental theorem of poker. And what they said, right, was the deeper the stacks we have, right? So say your stack is 1 million. We always have to be able to threaten the nuts because otherwise our opponent can just, push us off our hand every single time. So we kind of always have to have the very top hands in our distribution. So that means, on a board of ace, 3, 4 of hearts, and we raise under the gun, we have to have the 5 deuce of hearts some non-zero fraction of the time. Again, if we're playing super deep. We don't have to have it, we don't have to raise all of them. We just have to have some non-zero probability of them. And as stacks get smaller, right, this gets less and less important. So if we're playing like 30 big blinds, it doesn't really matter if we have like quad kings in our distribution or king 8 in our distribution or not. But all hands that can make the nuts, in theory, with some non-zero probability, we want to have them in our distribution. So looking back, right, like it doesn't feel that good to be folding these hands that we'd want to bet for value. So what we can do to fix our river distribution is we can add more value hands in on the turn, right? So we say we add in Jack 10, Jack 9 suited. We have some more pairs, that we're actually betting, right, instead of checking back. We have some more pairs. And when we look back at our enumerated river distribution, we're bringing all our king 10s in, or all our king queens in, most of our king tens in, and that's a good start, right? That's a good start. And you can see how if we continue going through that process, we can add in more value hands and more value hands, and eventually like our bluff catching threshold will be large enough that our value betting threshold feels right, right? So like at the end of the day, like we have to gut check these results. And so you can imagine, right, we could construct a distribution where we fold, where we end up calling with aces on the end there too. And we don't have to add in that many more hands. You know, we probably add in Jack 9, Jack 8, Jack 7. We probably add in another 25 or 30 hands to our distribution, and all of a sudden it becomes a lot easier. We clearly call with all of our trips, and we fold, and actually we call with all of our aces too, right? So this is starting to, a lot of people like to polarize their distributions. I like to polarize my distribution. And basically what I mean by that is I like to make my decisions easy. So I'm calling with all my trips, calling with my aces. I make my decisions easy by having a few more hands in sort of my bluff catching range, right? So kind of like the thicker I make this, the easier this gets. And the thinner I make this, kind of the more tough decisions, the more really bad decisions it feels like I'm going to have to make. So I want to look at that turn one more time. So if this is really our turn betting distribution, for the bet size, right, our bluffing ratio should be 0.4. And this is kind of an imperfect metric, but if we kind of enumerate what hands are kind of bluffs, what hands are kind of value hands, finding out that we're only bluffing about 18% of the time, right? So what does that mean? That means we're pretty exploitable on this turn, right? Our opponent can just come in and he can, well, what would he do? So if you have this kind of read that I'm only bluffing 18% of the time, what are you going to do? Just fold a bunch more hands, right? So how do we fix this? You know, we can kind of look in, well, are there any other bluff hands I can add here? I guess I can maybe start bluffing my 6-5 suiteds. Actually, 6-5 is a pair. There actually aren't very many real bluffing hands, right? Like pairs are kind of bluff catchers still. So we don't have a lot of bluffing hands that we can add in on the turn. So what do? We go back, we tweak how we play the flop differently. We play the flop a little bit differently. We see how that works. We might have to start adding in more hands pre-flop. So it's an iterative process, guys, right? So we start at the river. I always like to start at the river because the river, it's like, the decisions are pretty clear. You know, you don't have to worry about equities. You don't have to worry about what's a bluff and what's not a bluff. What you know is you have a good sense of what you want to be betting, right? And you can kind of check, am I betting what I want to be betting? Okay, given that I'm betting these hands, or given that I'm calling with these hands, does that say that I played the turn well? Does that say that I played the turn poorly? Right? So we look at our turn distribution. Do I have easy decisions here? Or do I have hard decisions here? Right? So we work through our turn distribution. We can move it back to our flop distribution. We work from our flop distribution. We can move it back to our pre-flop distribution. So go through this quickly. And I guess we'll stop for a minute. The first thing that you want to do when reading your own hand, you want to fix the glaring errors. We're not trying to solve poker to the first or second decimal point here. So use this to fix the glaring errors. We're bluffing 18%, that's way too low. We're folding hands that are this, and if you're folding hands that are the second or the third nuts to one bet, that's way too high. And you'll be really surprised, like how often these glaring errors show up. Like for me, I read my own hands, they still show up all the time. So it's a constant process of kind of honing your game. Another thing this tells us is that we don't want to needlessly bifurcate our distributions. And what I mean by that is if we start betting different amounts with different hands, if we go back to, this, right? you probably have, how many combinations of hands is this? I forget how many combinations it is. We probably have about 90 combinations of hands here. And if we start betting different amounts with different hands, now we're going to get down to 45 combinations of hands or something like that if we raise one set for a different amount pre-flop than another set. And when we do that, we make these errors, right? The difference between, should I call with queens or ace jack? We make them a lot easier to make because this is spread wider, right? So these errors become proportionally larger and proportionally more easy to make. And the question is, what value do you actually gain from it? If you're not gaining a lot of value from betting different amounts with different types of hands, what you're doing is you're making it a lot harder to balance. You're making it a lot harder to play well later in the hand. So I think that's another big thing that comes out of reading your own hand. So another thing which I meant to do here, but we didn't, is to do the tree for all the possible actions, not just the path you took, right? So we looked at all the hands that we were betting on the turn, right? But we could also look at all the hands that we didn't bet, right? Because all the hands that we're betting leaves us with a different set of hands that we're not betting. So, and very often, right, you might find that, like, if you're going to, like, bet and fold, like, your top two pairs or whatever on different textured boards, your checking distribution is way, way off. So you want to go through your betting and your checking distribution. And the final thing, before we pause for a minute, is you can use this to sort of identify where we tend to become imbalanced and then look at that, or look for those spots in opponents. You know, like if on this turn we're becoming imbalanced by bluffing way too infrequently, our opponents are quite likely going to be doing the same thing. And you can start to kind of catch those reads. And you can start to kind of catch places where people could be screwing up. And if you can figure out those places, you can kind of move into exploitive play, which, should we pause now and we'll talk about when we come back? Okay, take a break.
Cool. Yeah, I just paused it. Oh, I see the mouse doesn't work.